Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's show, we're joined by Sean Lahman, a Watchdog reporter for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, New York. In that role, he covers public safety and his specialty, data-driven stories. His work is sometimes featured in USA Today. He's been at this paper since 2010. Sean previously worked for the New York Sun. I know him for the books he's edited. He's into sports encyclopedias, and we very much travel in the same baseball circles. But today, different conversation. Sean, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be with you.
All right, so we've touched on investigative reporting with past guests from Investigate West, Mississippi Free Press. We've hit on data journalism with Crosstown LA. Now we look at New York State and a combination of both. But first, I want to talk about your path. And I find it interesting because it seems like you've come into the field when the industry was on the downs. You don't necessarily see too many people with 10 plus years at one stop anymore. So can you take us through your journalism path?
Well, it's interesting. I actually didn't set out to be a journalist. I was a psychology major as an undergrad. I wanted to do research, design and conduct experiments and then publish your analysis. But as I got into that, I loved the statistical work and the programming, but I realized I was less interested in human behavior and brain science than I was in statistics and writing. So I came out of college with those computer programming skills and an understanding of statistics, and I went to work in the research labs at Eastman Kodak. In the early 90s, they were doing, that was the beginning of digital imaging. I had never really thought about journalism as a career, but I had started doing some freelance baseball writing in college. There was this interesting window of time between the mid 80s and maybe the mid 90s. We had the dawning of what we call then rotisserie baseball, now fantasy baseball. So there was this incredible hunger for, detailed scouting reports and data for individual players, but we didn't have the World Wide Web yet. And so there were all of these magazines and books that were being published in the late 80s and 90s. And that's really where I got my start writing. I put together what turned out to be a pretty popular baseball website in the mid 90s with the baseball database that I put together. And that led to my job working for Total Sports, which was a publishing company based out of New York that did the big, 1,400 page encyclopedias that were pretty common at that time. Total Baseball, which was the official encyclopedia of baseball. But we also did official encyclopedias for the NFL and the National Hockey League, and we did basketball and tennis and the Olympics and stuff like that. Speaking of dying industries, the encyclopedia business was not a thriving market to jump into in the late 90s. But that's what I did. And then from there, I got a job working for the New York Sun, first as a kind of a columnist, but then as more of a beat reporter. And I fell in love with it. I just fell in love with the newspaper world. And then I came back up here to Rochester in 2010 to work for the paper here, which is part of the USA Today network. Gannett has I don't know, more than 200 papers across the country. And here in New York State, I think it's 12 local daily papers. So my job here combines, those data skills that I have and my passion for storytelling. I went back to school in my 40s to get some formal journalism training, but I really found that, I've been guided well by kind of those two skill sets, the ability to pull large amounts of data and information together and to distill it and then to try to make some sense of it through some storytelling. So a lot of the stories I write here in Rochester or across New York or for the USA Today, a lot of those are stories that are driven by data work, but some of it is just old-fashioned reporting.
I think there's a couple of things here. One is, does Gannett have a lot of people with your combination of skills? Because I think within the industry that I'm thinking that at least at the time that you would have started, that might have been somewhat.
I think it was rare. I think, there are folks certainly in the news business who are good at working with databases. We have USA Today has a data team, but I think it's unusual to have people with those technical skills who also have those storytelling skills. And a lot of times what happens in journalism, or at least what I've seen, is trying to team up people with those different skill sets. But there are not a lot of us who I think feel equally comfortable living in both of those worlds.
All right, so let's give some examples. On your page on the DNC website, there are databases for, among other things, Rochester athletes, which was tied to something you did on Abby Wambach, state pensions, home sales, restaurant inspections, money owed to New York residents. And that's the tip of the iceberg. The website data.democratandchronicle.com has so many. And I look back a couple of years, July 2018, you did a story about one of the oldest ever murder victims. So I got to think that that's a database. How do you come up with the ideas for these? How are they created? How are they maintained? And how do they help?
Yeah, some of those are very utilitarian databases. We take public records and we put them into an interactive format so readers can get some value out of those. Home sales are public record, but there's so many of them. It's hard to make sense of them. So we've done some work to try to put that in a format where people can get some useful information out. Same way with restaurant inspections. A lot of those things are the raw data is compiled by state agencies or local agencies, but they don't put them out there in a format that's easily accessible. So that's one of the main things that I do. One of the areas that I spend a lot of time is building and maintaining these what I call utility databases. You mentioned a database we have about local athletes. The newspaper here has been naming all-star teams for local high school sports. Going back to the 60s, they started doing football, and later they added in basketball and soccer. Now I think they do maybe 25 sports a year, but we had the idea to compile all of those names and to put them into a database. About 8,000 kids, I think, who've been honored as star athletes. And, like most high school athletes, even the good ones, don't necessarily go on to big careers. But you mentioned Abby Wambach. She was a local soccer player, actually a star in basketball as well, before she went on to big things on the international stage. But a lot of times, folks don't know that NBA players or NHL players or kids in the major leagues, they don't necessarily know that they came from this hometown. So that's something where we got some utility out of our own data that we published.
So is your
And you mentioned another story that I wrote a couple years ago about one of the oldest murder victims. That was a woman named Marsha Morrison here, who was 101 and murdered in her apartment. It just the question occurred to me when we covered that case as it happened. It's unusual for someone to be murdered at that age. It's unusual for someone to be alive at that age, I guess. It prompted the question, is this the oldest person who's ever been murdered here? It's not something you can Google to get the answer, but I knew that there were various historical sources that could, help me get that information together. And so it turned out to be, I thought, a pretty interesting context behind, this horrible event.
On a practical level, is this just a matter of like you sit with the information and you're like, okay, I want this column, this column, this column, this column, and this column with this information, this information, this information, and then you just punch it all?
It's usually not like that. A lot of the times, it starts with, usually for me, it starts with a question. And I try to think, how can I get the answer to that question? And then go out looking for information. Sometimes it does go like that in terms of building a spreadsheet. I guess when we're building that list of the local athletes who've been standouts. More often, though, it's you're getting data in a form that doesn't lend itself to analysis. So, for example, one of the things that we've been looking at, one of the things I've been interested in is deaths in the state prison system. That can come from, most of those are from natural causes, but people can die from suicide, they can die from homicide, they can die from a drug overdose. Every time that happens, every time a person in custody dies, they do an investigation and a report is issued. We were trying to get some overview of how often this was happening and what were the various issues. There was no place we could go to ask that question. So we filed an open records request for all of these reports, and we had to go through each one to try to kind of categorize them and to to essentially build that database from scratch, since it didn't exist anywhere. Sometimes sometimes there's some really interesting insights can be yielded from doing that work. Sometimes you do that work and there's no good answers there, so you don't always know when you set out.
Let's take it from one other angle. Is everything you mentioned public records for the most part? Have you ever done anything like a David Farrenhold like call out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as, calling up a government agency, asking for data, and they say, "Oh yeah, we have that," and they send it to you. But most times, it's not that easy. One of the things I've written a lot about in the last 5 years or so has been sex abuse cases. People who are now adults who are coming forward and saying they were abused as children. And every time I would write one of those stories, I would get an email or get calls from other people who would say, "Yeah, that happened to me too." So one of the things that we've done in our coverage of these cases is to put that call out and to say to people, "Hey, what were your experiences at this summer camp, or what were your experiences with this Boy Scout troop?" And it's kind of a strange form of crowdsourcing, but that's an example of, unfortunately, of stories that get told because we have people like that come forward with their stories. But what David did was essentially the only way he was going to tell that story, right? He wanted to know about Donald Trump's charitable contributions, and there was no place he could go to. There was no database of that, so he had to figure out, how do I build this from scratch? It's a great model, and it's a great way to get at questions that are very hard to answer.
Yep. And for those listening, CUNY Newmark actually has a free set of videos from David Farrenhold explaining his entire process, which I certainly recommend. Of your databases, which one's your favorite?
Which one's my favorite? I will say one of the databases that I enjoy, we update and I write about from time to time, is the unclaimed funds database. The state, if for some reason lose track of money somewhere, the state ends up with that. And the reason why I like that is because we update that all the time. And almost every time I do it, I hear from friends or family members or even readers who say, "Hey, I was in there. I have no idea why Verizon owes me $42, but I was happy to have it." And even though I do that all the time, I've probably written that story 6 or 8 times. 2 years ago, I found money that was owed to me, and so that was awesome.
That must have been a very pleasant surprise.
Yeah, it was.
Reporter not only finding information for himself. All right, I mentioned Farrenhold and government watchdogging. You won a First Amendment award for your and a team's work on coverage of Governor Andrew Cuomo. I read the piece last night. It tracked how companies that had business with New York State were large donors to the governor's campaign and taking advantage of some loopholes in laws in the process. And the fundraising was also tied to criminal convictions. As I said, you were part of a team on this. There's text, maps, charts, graphs, ton of stuff. Can you explain what the story was and what went into the reporting of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, in a nutshell, Cuomo had raised over $100 million since he first ran for governor. And that's a huge amount of money for gubernatorial races. We wanted to take a look. The campaign finance records are open, but all it gives you is a name and how much money somebody gave. And what we wanted to do was to see if we could figure out who those major donors were. And, it was a lot of work to try to match up names of companies and names of individuals. But as we did that with again, hundreds of thousands of individual records, we began to get an understanding of who all of those campaign donors were. And a lot of it, it turns out, were from companies that were doing business with the state. And it created the impression of a pay-to-play environment where donors would get these lucrative state contracts. And as you said, part of the outcome of this was some criminal charges and convictions of people who were not so careful about covering up their activities of quid pro quo.
So basically investigative and watchdog reporting at its finest.
Yeah.
All right, so you cover public safety. There's some rough stuff there. You mentioned sexual abuse by the Catholic Church, murder stories, torture stories. Our audience doesn't have the experience you do. I know for me, I could never do that. How do you cover those and deal with the emotional aspect of it?
Well, there's no easy answer to that. In the moment when I'm at a crime scene, or if I'm interviewing an abuse survivor or covering a murder trial, I'm able to focus on the work and my job, which is to tell a difficult story. And when I'm faced with that task, I feel a pretty strong responsibility, not just to tell a story of this awful thing that's happened to someone, but to try to give some context and help people understand how this reaches beyond, a small moment in time. I like to say reporters are not stenographers. My job in telling those stories isn't simply to recite the facts or to take down the words that people say. It's to absorb all of that and to try to make sense of it and to share with readers, the impact of what happened and sometimes the broader implications of that. And you can't do that. I think you can't do it well unless you engage with real empathy, and that can be exhausting in a lot of ways, and it takes a toll. There've been a number of murder cases, as an example, that I've covered from the day that the incident happened, from being on the scene as police are there, through to the trial process and the end of that, which can sometimes be a couple of years, and you get to know the family members of the victims, and you get to know, the impact that these people had in the community. And I think as reporters, we understand the challenges of doing this kind of work. I think journalists as a group have studied the challenges of that, and we understand, the risks of burnout. And we have, at least I could say, in our organization, we have good support systems, we have peer counseling and the like, but it doesn't ever get any easier to cover those kinds of stories.
What's the hardest part of the job for you?
I think the hardest part for me is two things. One, sometimes in covering crimes like murder, the question that people want to know is, why did this happen? Why did this guy kill his wife? Or why did this 19-year-old murder his father? There's never an answer to that. There's never an answer to the why that makes any rational sense. And so, the not to be a nihilist, but the just the emptiness, the banality of some of these crimes is difficult. But as I've been covering a lot of these sex abuse cases within the Catholic Church, it's been a big issue here locally, also the Boy Scouts. And the thing that strikes me when I talk to these people, a lot of times these people who were abused as young men, it's almost always men, not always, but these people who were abused as adolescents, the trauma of what happened to them, they don't really understand that until they get much older, until they get into their 40s, oftentimes, sometimes even older, and they begin to look back at their life and say, I've had failed marriages, I've had problems with substance abuse and alcohol, had other issues, and, need to understand that all of that misfortune in their life has its roots and origins in something that they were a victim to when they were 12 or 14 years old. And for me, what's been really jarring is to see the frequency with which things like that happened, how often these things happened in the past, and how damaging they can be, not just to the victim, but to the people around them. And so I guess at the end of the day, when you're covering crime and you're covering unpleasant topics like that, it makes you understand the toll of suffering that exists, and that's I think the toughest part of that.
You have a combination of the statistical side of the job with the database reporting, and as you said, the empathetic part of the job with covering the things that you do. Can you give us an example of what you do in a given week?
Sure. Let's see. This week we have, well, I'll give you two examples. I did a story early this week about, we looked at the pension data. That's something we look at for teachers. The state pays out pensions to retired teachers. And one of the things that was clear as I looked at it was that a lot of teachers took a retirement last year during the pandemic, which is a continuation of a trend. So there's a concern about whether or not schools are going to have enough teachers in the fall. That was kind of a daily analysis that I did. We've got election primaries coming up, which is always an interesting time. We have early voting here and absentee voting, and then the primaries. So there's a big data component to that. Real estate market, I wrote a story about the craziness that's going on in the local real estate market here. We have affordable housing for the most part. Home prices have been very low historically, but during the pandemic, there's been this incredible surge of people who've been moving out of New York City or out of other big cities who want to go someplace that's more affordable and to get away from dense clusters. And that's driven home prices up here through the roof to a point where people are making offers significantly over the asking price on the first day a house gets listed, and sometimes still not being able to get the home. So those are the kinds of things that I've been looking at this week, and fairly typical of either looking at some data and seeing something interesting and exploring that, or seeing an interesting trend or sensing something is going on and then going to see if we can find some data to back that up.
Okay, I've got some advice questions to round out the interview that we typically do at the end for
right.
aspiring students and such that listen. This one we always call the Emmy question, named after the young woman who interned for us on the podcast, Emmy Lederman. She would always ask, are there any gaps that aspiring journalists can look to fill in your industry?
That's a good one. I think traditionally in our business, in the journalism business, we've kind of organized around beats where people have knowledge and skills in certain topic areas, whether it be, covering sports or politics or education. I think that's changing, and I think what's really important is more about the skills that you can bring to the table. So I think there's a huge need for folks with a blend of reporting skills and tech skills. I think being able to do interactive graphics and things like that is in huge demand. Versatility, I think, is a big key, especially as newsrooms have continually gotten smaller. I think being able to do different kinds of reporting, and there's also a big demand for folks who are bilingual, quite frankly, as newsrooms try to get more diverse. So if you're Spanish speaking in the journalism field, there's a lot of opportunities. There's companies looking to hire.
Unquestionably. What's the number one tip that you give to reporters about making their own databases?
Oh, that's a good one. I would say start gathering data and spend less time worrying about how to organize it at first. If you go in with some preconceived notions about what the fields in your spreadsheet should look like, you may get pretty far down the path before you realize that you had missed out on some key information. I think the most important thing to do, I mentioned that research I'm doing now on prison deaths, get as much information as you can, digest as much of it as you can before you start trying to organize it, because that's really where sometimes you go in with thinking the story is one thing and it turns out to be something else. So I guess what I would say is, just when you're building a database, all you're doing is just collecting and aggregating all of this information, and focus on at the outset, and don't tie yourself down or make assumptions too early.
Is there anything about your job that you would say, like, to a younger person who might have their doubts about the, I guess, I don't want to say the excitement level, but maybe that, is there anything in particular about the excitement level of the job that you find, or something about the job that you find particularly, not necessarily exciting, but like intellectually stimulating or anything like that?
Well, I think those of us who are in the news business are adrenaline junkies, because there's always stuff happening, there's always new information, and there's always the thrill of the pursuit. So for me, it's never been slow paced, it's never been boring. And I think the business has changed so much since I first got into it. When I started writing for the New York Sun, they did not have a website. Now everything's online. Everything is so much faster, especially with social media. For me, it's just I'm driven by curiosity, and I like to be in the know. I like the fact that if there's something happening in my town, I can call up the local police chief, or I can call the mayor's office and find out what's going on. And, I come home at the end of the day and my wife is watching stuff on news and she says, "Hey, did you hear about this?" And I said, "Yeah, I was actually there when that happened." So that's, I didn't have that bug when I was a young person for the thrill of journalism, but I certainly have it now. And I think most people who have stuck around in this business, that's what keeps them going.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. So last question. Is there someone or an organization that you're not associated with that you would like to salute
That's a good question. You're talking about like a charitable organization?
within journalism?
Within journalism. Well, there's a group that I'm not associated with, but that I have benefited from, which is called the Solutions Journalism Network. And that's an organization that it does a couple of things. There's an educational component where they come to papers or to journalism schools and talk about techniques, but really what they do is serve as a resource for not just identifying problems, but connecting those problems with a solution. So it's easy to say caregivers are overwhelmed during the pandemic, people who've got older parents. But what do we do about that? What are programs that are working? What are solutions that maybe they're doing in Milwaukee that would be beneficial to do here in Rochester or vice versa? That's a great organization. They've got a lot of stuff online that you can see, and the benefits of their work you can see all across the country.
Absolutely. And
solutionsjournalism.org.
Yep. As a matter of fact, they were our guests episode 3 way back when we were first starting.
Right. There
nice.
You go.
That's a perfect callback.
All
Sean
right.
Lahman, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark.
The Journalism Salute is dedicated to the memory of Dr. Robert Cole, who ran the journalism program at my alma mater, Trenton State College, the College of New Jersey, for more than 30 years. In a 2006 interview with the college newspaper, Dr. Cole was asked, "What's the most important thing a journalist should know?" His answer, "How to find things and how to find out things, and where to look for information." That's an area that Sean Lahman finds important too. He's making it easier both for journalists and for readers with his data-driven work. Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter @JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.